Hi, I'm Emily Sharp.
And I'm Jackie Shivanis. Thanks so much for coming to our presentation on adapting beginning decoding instruction for students in fourth grade and above. We're very excited to be here at the 2024 Patent Literacy Symposium to present this information to you all. Next slide. So our agenda, the things we're going to be discussing for today include the rationale about why do some students need basic decoding instruction even after fourth grade. We'll talk about the extent of that problem, and then we're going to go into some specifics on how to adapt structured literacy instruction, which typically we think of as being delivered in early elementary grades. But how do we adapt that type of instruction for upper elementary and even into high school students? Then we'll present you with a couple of case studies, and then at the end, we'll have some time for your questions. And I will say that I apologize for not being able to be here in person. Your questions will be ably answered by Dr. Sharp, though.
Thanks, Jackie.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is why is explicit instruction in decoding skills needed after third grade? So what are the things that teachers need to be able to know and do in order to provide that kind of instruction to older students? So this is a widespread problem. The latest scores from the National Assessment of Educational Progress in the United States show that only 33% of fourth grade students score at or above proficient level. Same for eighth grade, only 31% of those kids are reading proficiently, and 37%, so less than 40%, of seniors in high school are reading proficiently. And what's even more troubling is that these scores have not changed substantially in 30 years. So this problem is not only significant, it's persistent. So who are these students who are not reading proficiently? David Kilpatrick has created this graphic of different types of reading problems that you are likely to see in students that you work with. So if we think about the simple view of reading, right, which says that reading comprehension is the product of decoding skill, and language comprehension. We can use that framework to sort of delineate what areas do struggling readers like how do they sort of cluster along these skills? So your strong readers are your typically developing readers are going to have strong word reading skills and strong language comprehension. Your weak readers are going to have difficulties in word reading as well as difficulties in language comprehension. So students who have stronger word reading skills but weak language skills are the students in that upper right-hand box, sometimes referred to as hyperlexic. Sometimes they're called word callers. So these are students who appear to be reading accurately and fluently. However, on a reading comprehension assessment measures, they don't score well. They don't remember what they read. They can't explain what they're reading, and they have difficulty applying knowledge that's gained from reading because they're not gaining that knowledge from reading. And then in the lower right-hand corner are students who experience difficulties in both, right? So these are students who have decoding issues as well as students who have language comprehension issues. So you'll notice those are students who read slowly, they read effortfully, they read inaccurately, and they also, I mean, understandably, right, are not gaining a lot of knowledge and information from the things that they're reading. If you look at the lower box on the left-hand side, so these are the students who have significant issues with decoding. So oftentimes we say that these students are dyslexic, right? They have phonological processing issues. Their main problem is the decoding. When they are presented with information using oral language, language, they often have adequate comprehension, right? They can learn well, um, but their problem is decoding the words on the page. However, some of the students in this category who have these weak decoding skills can present as what we call a compensator. So the compensator is a student who has weak decoding skills, but because of their high level of oral language proficiency, they can use strategies such as guessing or predicting or anticipating what the word might be. And so these are students who may go undetected. Their decoding difficulties may go undetected for some time until they reach a higher level, right? So when the text becomes more complex in third grade and fourth grade, sometimes these are referred to as late emerging struggling readers. And so they also are students who are going to require explicit decoding instruction after third grade. So the as I kind of just described on that slide, some of this information is a little repetitive on this slide. But so in general, there's like two groups of students who require intensive reading intervention after third grade. So language skills are impaired, but word reading is good, right? So those are those hyperlexic students. And so the smallest number of students are in this group. I think it's about like 15% of students are in this category. Often these are students who are on the autism spectrum, but not always. So these are students who have impaired language comprehension. So it can be often their difficulties in language comprehension may not necessarily be specific to vocabulary, for example. It's more along the lines of things like syntax, right? They have difficulties with discourse, with pragmatics, right? Using language for communication, using language for problem solving. Um, and so again, that's a small group of students. And the way that we work with those students is we need to improve their oral language comprehension. And so that is the hyperlexic group. Now we're going to look more at the students who have difficulty with word reading, right? So these are students who have intact language skills. Their language comprehension is pretty good, but they have that difficulty with decoding. So the dyslexic kids are the ones who are early identified, right? We see them begin to struggle early on in the process of them learning those decoding skills. So they have initial difficulty with sound symbol associations, and they need explicit and often more intensive instruction in phonological and phonemic awareness. Then, as I said, the compensators often are the late identified kids. These students hide their decoding issues because they can use their oral language skills to compensate for their decoding skills. So it appears that they are reading fluently when actually they are not. They're guessing, they're not decoding all of those words. And one of the ways you can tell when a student is a compensator is that they'll have really poor spelling, even though they may appear to be reading the words correctly. And so that spelling challenge is reflective of their phonological awareness deficits. So the other group of students are the students who have mixed reading difficulty. So they need both types of intervention. They need the decoding intervention, and they also need oral language skills instruction. So the majority of these students are the ones who will exhibit these global reading difficulties, and they really struggle when they are provided only with instruction that uses guided reading and whole language approaches, right? They really need that explicit phonics instruction. They're less likely to be identified with a learning disability and less likely to get intervention, often because of a sort of attitude that they're weak overall, and therefore their lower level of performance is indicative of their capacity, right? Which is not true. If they are given specifically targeted decoding instruction as well as specific intervention in oral language comprehension, their achievement can be remediated to a typical level. Oftentimes these kids get labeled, right? We think that they're just not trying, they're not interested. And so that's typically not the case, right? They're struggling because they're not being provided with effective instruction. And so if they are not provided with that effective instruction, these are kids who then will sometimes begin to exhibit problem behaviors because of their frustration, right? Because they're being continually presented with tasks, with task demands that they have not yet received effective instruction in able to be in order to be able to perform those skills.
Jackie, and this is the largest group you're going to see in your classrooms. Sometimes they're identified as at risk, but there's students who are not identified with a disability, so they're not getting intervention. And so if you're not using explicit instruction in your core instruction, they don't have as much of an opportunity then to develop their reading, right?
And so when we're looking at specifically older students who are behind in reading, so what are the contributing factors, right, that are causing these students to be behind in reading? So the first one, obviously, dyslexia. If a student is dyslexic and has phonological processing issues that are challenging and they cannot decode the words on the page, then they are going to be behind in reading. Specific learning disability in reading. So both the decoding issues and the oral language comprehension issues contribute to specific learning disabilities in reading. And so those are the students who have diagnosable disabilities, right? But there are many other students who struggle in reading because they were given poor core instruction, right? Most students benefit from explicit instruction in phonological awareness and decoding skills. So if those students were not provided with that effective early reading instruction, then they may struggle with reading throughout their progression throughout elementary school, and they will struggle more and more as the reading becomes more challenging. The other issue is that after third grade, oftentimes core curriculum no longer addresses phonological skills. And so the students who didn't get it in those early grades are not being provided with it once they reach third grade. And so then they just fall further and further behind. And when we're looking at kids falling further and further behind, that's a global thing that happens, right? So number one, we may have lowered expectations for these kids. Again, they get labeled as lazy, unmotivated, but also when they are missing out on the kinds of reading that is going on in the classroom as well as outside of school reading, the Matthew effect has been shown to contribute to an ongoing like vicious cycle of underperformance. So the lack of reading practice leads to lower levels of vocabulary, lower levels of background knowledge, which leads then to have more struggles in comprehension, as well as not building those strong decoding skills for multisyllabic words and the more challenging kinds of spellings that students are encountering in higher level reading curriculum or reading materials that are presented in content area classes. And so they fall further behind. Reading becomes more challenging, they do less reading, and they continue to fall further behind. So the this is again a little bit more about this Matthew effect. So the effect of poor reading skills, as I said, is cumulative, right? That lack of practice leads to less progress in reading, less learning overall, and just exacerbates the same kinds of challenges that these students have. And so another issue is that as students progress through the grades, oral reading is de-emphasized and silent reading is emphasized. So now these kids are set with books that they cannot read and they're expected to read them independently. And when they're reading silently, no one's able to monitor how accurately they're reading. And so sometimes schools are reluctant to continue oral reading or to continue providing reading materials that are at the decodable level of a student because they are concerned that these activities may appear to be babyish. Things like doing phonological drills and things like that at higher grade levels are often not seen as something that's age appropriate. However, if it is going to allow these students to develop the skills that they need to be able to read successfully, then it is worth using those strategies in your instruction.
So now we're going to talk about adapting instruction for older students. So what you're trying to do is, what you want to avoid is, we're going to say start with a diagnostic assessment, right? So you know exactly what they know and you can build upon that. But what we don't want to do is to get into this, what they used to do when I was starting out in reading instruction is they would say, we're going to fill in the holes. We're going to fill in the missing pieces. And that's not how it works. You have to really build that wall from the foundation. And so you really want to make the reading system cohere, and you don't want to take a piecemeal approach to instruction. And so how do you take this scope and sequence of instruction and all of these great routines and this explicit instruction and try and adapt it so that it's going to work better for older students? And here are some of the precepts for working with older students. Just to get started, it's a little bit different working with students 4th grade and above. And so these are students who, you know, you're going to be setting up routines and procedures in an explicit instruction approach. You're going to be asking them to be responsive to cues within the instruction. And when I was trained in Orton Gillingham. We were having the kids trace while they're reading and saying while they're spelling. And some kids will be very reluctant to do this because an older student may feel that someone's going to see them tracing, someone's going to hear them saying the sounds. And so, you can allow them to sub-vocalize rather than saying those sounds out loud. I had a student who was a 7th grade student, and in the tracing, he didn't want to do the tracing on the table, but he would do it on his knee underneath the table, just to kind of have that motoric component to trigger that association when he was reading. So some of the things you want to do to overcome reluctance to follow routines and procedures are using decodable passages, just a paragraph or two to read to practice the new skill in connected text. But then, as Jackie was saying before, give them the opportunity to read what they're interested in. Give them something to read that will motivate them to practice reading. Give them, the sense that there are things you can read that are really interesting and valuable to you. If all they want to do is read about Star Wars, let them read about, Star Wars weapons or whatever, give them that. If they just want to read joke books, give them the joke books. And then there's this using praise and corrective feedback effectively. And one of the things you don't want to do with older students is communicate the message that there are things you cannot do. I'm telling you, you can't do this. I'm telling you, I'm helping you, I'm teaching you to read. I always say I'm teaching the student to read better, okay? When they make errors, sometimes these kids can be very hard on themselves. And so you want to, always be communicating that errors show learning. That mistake makes sense from what you know. And, I'm just explaining to you why it isn't that way, but it's a logical mistake that you made. Or, using behavior specific praise. Tell them what they're doing that is helping them. I see you're slowing down a little bit so that you're getting accurate. And that's what you should be doing at this point. I like to see that, and then there's this concept of the power of yet. They can't do it yet, especially when you're talking to colleagues, especially when you're talking to families. You want to avoid saying, they're not able to do this without saying yet. You say, we're working on this. This is something they're learning to do. And I think that all of this is helping to overcome the reluctance of the older student to participate in explicit instruction, structured literacy lessons. I'll just add one more thing, which is probably the most important component, and this is a Anita Archer thing, is keeping the lesson going at a perky pace. Okay, if you have the lesson routines down and you're moving along, the student just gets into the groove, the lesson is over in no time, right? And I think that that's a big piece of working with older students. They like the routine. They'll remind you if you forget something in the routine. So the first step you want to do with the older students, find out what they know, find out what they can do, because you don't want to be hammering at skills that they already have. And you also want to be leveraging anything they already know. It isn't a piecemeal process, but what it is it's giving you a fund of information, of knowledge that they have that you can build controlled lessons from. So you can use oral reading fluency passages to assess the function, the system, the reading system, and how well it's functioning. Fluency and oral reading fluency passages is giving you a sense of the overall reading system. You can't really use those diagnostically. You can't really use those to highlight skills, but it can give you an overall reading ability. And when you look at the Acadience training for Acadience mentors, if you're using Dibble's passages, Ameswood passages, same thing, they will tell us you can test down grade levels till you get to a level of oral reading fluency passage where you can get good information. The grade level passages are very difficult. They've been that way from the beginning. And so you might have kids, you don't want to keep giving them a grade level passage that they can barely read 2 sentences out of it, in a minute. You want to assess phonemic awareness and phonological awareness to see if a phonological deficit is implicated. You might use the PAST or a CTOP to find out what their phonological awareness skills are, to see if in general there's a deficit. But these are easily remediated skills. So you might also want to use something that's more diagnostic. I think the CTOP's more diagnostic, isn't it, Jackie?
Mm-hmm.
The PAST kind of gives you an overview. But it isn't going to tell you which skills necessarily to teach, right?
Right.
Makes sense. And then you do an informal diagnostic. So you show them the spellings, ask them what sounds they know for those spellings, and so they're reading them. And then those that they are able to read, you then dictate for spelling. And so if the student can both read and spell the symbol and the sound symbol association, that will be known. Otherwise, if they can do one or the other but not both, then they need to have a lesson on it. They need to be taught it. So
Emily, can you talk for just, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can you talk for just a second about why is it important for older students specifically to be able to read and spell? Why do they have to do both to consider it known?
Because that's when I think that's when that the sound symbol association is firm. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop an internal process of orthographic mapping. And orthographic mapping is sound symbol associations in words in sequence that resolve to a word we recognize in our oral language or for oral language. And that is not going to happen unless you have both the sound and the symbol together. Also, I think that it makes it kind of eliminates that thing that older kids get really good at compensating, right?
Yep.
It keeps them from guessing this stuff. And sometimes there'll be upper level spelling associations that they know better than the regular vowel spellings.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want to kind of tease out what they've memorized and what they just, what they need to kind of hammer in. Does that make sense?
That's what I was going for, right? The
Yeah.
difference between things that they've just memorized and things that they actually have orthographically mapped.
Yeah, and you really want to have that there. So, absolutely, good point. And then non-decodable word knowledge, sometimes we call these sight words. The term sight words is not used anymore to mean like the Dolch words, words either that are irregularly spelled or you haven't taught the pattern yet and they need it right away in order to read text. Often the students have learned many of these irregularly spelled words, but they have difficulty differentiating the ones with different spellings, like through, thought, though. And that's where the spelling comes in too, right, Jackie? That's another thing for helping to differentiate this. So I was at a conference, actually, at Patton, and William Van Cleave was there, and I hadn't seen him in years. And he was the person who originally trained me. And they said, so how are you teaching red words? And I said, oh, I'm teaching them the way you taught me. And he said, no, use the heart word, procedure. And what the heart word procedure does is it says, these parts of the word are decodable. It's the part that is non-decodable you have to worry about. And that's actually worked for a lot of my students with the word said, because s and d are regular in that word, but the AI is like throwing us off. So we want to say said. And what I'll say to the kids is, probably back in the day in England, they used to say, and that's what I say to him, and then we had this great vowel shift. And so AI started to say, so it's said. And so, if you can dig into the spelling of these words, and these are words you want them to be able to spell and read. And then, they really have them down, these irregularly spelled words. But you want to tease out which ones do they have and which ones do they need to learn. And I apologize to kids for OUGH because it's famously, it makes many different sounds and many different important words. And then your language comprehension assessments. When I was taking a diagnosing dyslexia course at Fairleigh Dickinson, they said, you should use language comprehension assessment rather than read comprehension assessment. Reading comprehension is very difficult to assess, especially at upper levels. And so you can take something like the language comprehension part of a WISC, or ask your speech and language practitioner to assess expressive and receptive language skills to get a sense of their vocabulary and their general language knowledge. Okay. This is an example of a typical sequence of phonological skills. And this was put together with the assistance of the Fairleigh Dickinson Center for Dyslexia Studies. We're giving you the link here. It's got a nice explanation at the beginning of how to teach the skills and what kind of, order to teach the skills in. You're always adapting it. Any program you pick up, Foundations or ECRI or any of these programs are going to follow a very similar sequence to this one. Not going to get deeply into it, but you're starting with short A, 5 consonant sounds, and then you're building from there. And you can see that we're teaching syllable types in there. And if you read this document at the beginning, there are 2 pages that explain how you move between the columns. If you're selecting items for what to teach next, you have a lot of flexibility here based on what the student already knows. And so, with an older level student, you're going to be you're going to be following the sequence to a certain extent, but you're going to be going out of sequence here. If I had a very beginning student, and I've had 9th grade students who knew A and like 5 or 6 consonants, you're going to approach that differently than you're going to approach a situation where the student has some knowledge of some vowels, but they need explicit instruction on the other vowels, etc. Okay, just to give you an idea of that. So the adapted sequence would be always starting with the skills they already have, which are those patterns they can read and spell in isolation and in words. Once they have 1 vowel and 5 consonants, okay, they can spell closed syllables. And so you teach the closed syllable pattern. which is one vowel followed by at least one consonant. The vowel is short. We don't teach exceptions or schwad vowels at this point, right? Just a clean definition of a closed syllable. Then, as soon as we can, we teach the vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel, syllable finding pattern, where you're finding the syllable break between the two consonants. So you have you identify what are the vowels in the word, you code vowel to vowel, vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel. I see this pattern that I know, and that's where I find that syllable. And once they have words with you can teach multi-syllable words with two closed syllables. You can then teach basic skills in the context of both single syllable and multi-syllable words, which makes it more, I think it makes it seem more advanced for older students. And you want to be careful when you're giving them practice to select words the students are not likely to have memorized. So words like mantis and that kind of thing for a VCCV. Teach them, multi-syllable words. I would give them like 3-syllable words like Atlantic, Manhattan, incumbent, and have them find the VCCV patterns in a 3-syllable word. It's that kind of thing that kind of keeps it a little more upper level instructionally, and it seems, it's not that I don't want it to seem babyish, but I don't want it to seem basic. You're an older kid, you can handle this. That's the kind of thing where we're going with this. And then there are patterns that you want to teach earlier than you would to a younger beginning reader. Okay, you want to make sure you're teaching the comparative suffixes, which is and ist. You want to be teaching a bull, in addition to teaching ed and ing and suffix s. You want to get those in as quickly as you can, because then you can get to more syllable you can get to multi-syllable words through suffix adding. You want to make sure they have these basic prefixes. Un and in mean not, re, back or again, pre, before, and dis. Opposite or away from. These prefixes are found in a ton of academic words, the most common prefixes. You want to teach the soft C and G rule, because this comes up a lot in upper level reading, where when C or G are followed by E, I, or Y, they make the soft sound S and J. You teach them separately, not in the same lesson. And then they have the hard sounds of K and G. You want to teach what William Van Cleave called final stable syllables. So they're not exactly suffixes. They are actually, what they really are is a series of Latin suffixes that are found in together in stable syllables, usually final syllables of words in English. And this is shun, shun and jun, and chur and shus, and those kinds of syllables. And the value of that is that they give you syntactic information. Even though they're a final stable syllable, a shun or a chur word is going to be a noun. Okay. And then once you've got all of this in there, your first, whether a beginning reader or an older reader, your first experience of teaching the long vowel sounds is probably going to be something like a vowel team, an E, AI, AY kind of thing. But you also want to teach it before you teach open syllable, you teach vowel consonant E syllable. It's just easier to go between a closed syllable and a closed syllable with a silent E that makes the vowel say its name. And then you can get into closed syllable, silent E syllable pattern words, which are very common in academics. Butane, complete. Okay. No, butane is the other pattern. Complete, reptile. Those are words that are a closed syllable followed by vowel consonant E syllable. Then once you've taught open, then you can get into like butane and some of these other words that are found in academic word lists. Then you teach the VCV pattern, which gives you words that either start with an open syllable or closed syllable, and they have to go between those. And then you want to bring in CT and PT Latin roots, because the way we pronounce words with those, like ject, rupt, tact, struct, the way we pronounce these words, we don't hear the CTs in there. We're mostly pronouncing like structure. It doesn't, you don't get a kt in there, rupture. You don't really get those sounds in there, but once they learn the roots, then their spelling, it helps them for spelling and reading. Does that make sense? Did I leave anything
Yeah,
out there? That's good?
yeah,
Okay.
good.
Um, and so I already said, oh, what did I just do? Activities that build your background and vocabulary knowledge are very important for comprehension instruction. What did I do here? I had the same one. You want to provide lots of opportunities for them to use vocabulary in oral written language. And this is one of the things that I think is misunderstood about explicit instruction. When you have use explicit instruction in your lesson plan, that lesson is going to be like maximum 15-20 minutes. Most of what you're going to be doing in your classroom is you're going to be using the vocabulary that you're teaching. You're going to be using oral language to explain your thinking and to describe things. And so you want to give students a lot of opportunities to talk to each other, to express what they know, and to give you an insight into how they're thinking things through. Do they have any misconceptions that you can identify? We have to spend time in class listening to them as well, and giving them opportunities to speak. And you want to be teaching the language structures for reading and for speaking. Make sure that you're teaching parts of speech and what they call cohesive ties, which are those conjunctions and pronouns, and the reference to the pronouns and that kind of thing in the sentence and paragraph grammar that supports reading for understanding, and doing activities in the context of both sentences and paragraphs, doing those comprehension activities that way. And we talked about the passage reading. Anything else I need to add here? We need to add? We're good?
No, I think we're
Okay.
good.
All right. So
All right, so let's take a couple of case studies now to illustrate some of these principles and strategies that we've been talking about so far. So for our first case study, we're going to look at Althea. So Althea is a fourth grader who's reading at a second grade level. Um, so she learns information easily. She has a good vocabulary. Her handwriting and spelling, however, are less accurate than her peers. Um, Althea is one of those kids whose reading seemed fine until the end of third grade. And that's when she started to exhibit some difficulties with comprehending written text. So Althea is in so thinking about her emotional development, here's a kid who has thought that she was doing really well, right? She experienced success in those early grades, but now she's having difficulty. So she expresses frustration, right, when she's given these tasks that are now difficult for her. And it's difficult for her to understand why is she having trouble in something that she had always done very well in. So this leads to her becoming reluctant to read aloud in class. And because she was not a student targeted for intervention in kindergarten, first or second grade, she is resistant now to going with other students to receive intervention. So it's always important for older readers, right? For obviously for any child, right? It's important to consider their self-concept, their identity as a learner, and things like that. It can be more challenging, though, for students who develop these difficulties as older students when they didn't have them when they were younger.
mhm.
So, we're going to conduct some assessments, right, on Althea, and what we find is that her word recognition is below benchmark. So, Althea is one of those students who we would refer to as a compensator, right? Up until third grade, we weren't able to detect that she was having these word reading difficulties. But when we do assessments specifically targeted to word reading in isolation, right? When you're giving the student an assessment where they're just asked to read words in isolation, they no longer have those context clues. They don't have the ability to use the sense of the sentence to predict what the word is. They can't just look at two letters in a word and think, oh, it must be this word because that fits in the sentence. And so that's a way to detect those decoding issues. Also, her oral reading fluency can be impaired now because the text is becoming more complicated, right? When the text was simpler at a first grade level, her fluency didn't appear to be impaired. But now that the text is more complex, she'll be reading less fluently. And also, nonsense word fluency is probably the best way to detect those specific decoding difficulties that the student is having because they cannot use their memorized knowledge of words to supply a word. When they're given nonsense words, there's nothing that they can retrieve from their long-term memory that tells them what word that is. So they just have to apply their decoding skills. Her comprehension is falling below benchmark because she's not able to decode accurately, right? She's not able to accurately read the words that are on the page. So of course she's not able to comprehend what she's reading. And so the way that we assess the comprehension skills is using retell tasks, as well as maze or days. Days is just the Dibbles version of maze passages where students read passages and then they have to, they're given a couple of choices about what word fits best into this sentence and they have to select the word that fits the best.
And it's timed, right?
It's timed, it's 3 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we can also do some assessment of her language comprehension, right? So here's a student who has not been reading accurately. And so therefore, her ability to learn new vocabulary words through reading is going to become compromised. Right now, she's been able to kind of keep up because she has strong language comprehension. But if we don't intervene, on her decoding skills, she's going to be more and more challenged by her difficulties processing that written text. So even though she has adequate vocabulary now, it's not going to stay that way if we don't intervene. She does well on language comprehension tasks that do not involve reading connected text because she has that good oral language. And then she reads connected text more accurately than words in isolation for the reason we just talked about on the previous slide, right? She can't use, in connected text, she's able to use context clues and her background knowledge to guess at words, but guessing at words is not the same as reading words. So we can do the phonemic awareness assessments using the past and spelling tests. So her assessment shows that she's got deficits in blending and segmenting. Her responding to these prompts when we're asking her to blend and segment is slow and inaccurate. Her spelling errors are not phonologically consistent. So that shows us that she doesn't have very strong sound symbol associations for many of these phoneme grapheme pairs. So we can do some diagnostic phonics assessment on her as well. So we can see that her knowledge of orthographic patterns is applied inconsistently for reading and spelling. So she may be able to, she looks like she's able to read the word, but when you ask her to spell that spelling pattern that's shown in that word, she can't do it. She does not recognize base words with affixes. And she has a good memory for 1 and 2 syllable non-decodable words that are explicitly taught. So she has a good visual memory of like of memorizing, as we used to refer to them as sight words, right? But she's not processing those orthographically. She's just memorizing what the word looks like. So, in terms of intervention, what do we want to do to build her reading skills? We want to intervene on her phonemic awareness. So we want to give her practice segmenting at the syllable level first to ensure that she understands what segmentation is, right? So you can use compound words, you can use multisyllabic words, and have her separate them into syllables. Then move into segmenting the sounds in words, because this is where she's probably having more difficulty. And so starting out with words with 2 to 3 phonemes. So giving her practice blending and segmenting those short words. Then using finger spelling to support spelling words with known sound symbol associations. So adding in that kinesthetic or that motoric component to help reinforce her knowledge of those sound spelling associations. And using the heart word routines that Emily talked about before. So showing her a word that is a non-decodable word, pointing out what aspects of that word, what elements of that word are decodable, and then just focusing on memorizing the part of that word that's not phonologically decodable. So for the student, for Althea, we're definitely going to want to control the instructional materials to include only known patterns when we are practicing newly taught skills. But again, when she has opportunities to select what she wants to read, she should be encouraged to choose things that are motivating for her to read, and we can scaffold that reading for her. Follow structured literacy routines for review and for learning 1 new pattern per lesson. So again, the kind of structured literacy sequence is to review and spell the already known sounds in isolation, then read and spell words in isolation, blending words using a word chaining activity, and then new phonological and phonemic awareness activities. So always starting with a review of the known skills before we move into the introduction of a new skill. And so 1 new skill at a time, lots of opportunities to practice, and then more opportunities to review that newly taught skill in combination with her previously known skills. So teach the following specific skills: orthographic patterns for all the consonant sounds, the short and long vowel spellings, the short vowel protector rules, compound words, closed syllables, VCE syllable, and vowel teams, and then common suffixes. So you'll note with her, it's a little bit different than for a student who's significantly older, because she's still at a point where this is a reasonable sequence for her. She's going to be able to learn these things in a more traditional order than you might need to use for a student who's in 9th grade, for example. Once the closed syllable is mastered, then you're going to introduce again that VCCV syllable finding rule to read and spell words with 2 closed syllables, words like bandit, insect, and candid, right? This, you teach the student to identify where the vowels are, and then to identify the 2 consonants, and to show where those 2 syllables are going to be divided into 2 closed syllables. As each concept is mastered, you continue to follow the scope and sequence, similar to the one that Emily showed you on the other slide, with attention to introducing patterns found in academic words.
Okay. So that's Althea. Now we're looking at the second case study, which is Jamie, who's a 9th grader reading at a 3rd grade level. So he has not achieved functional literacy, which I think is like a 5th grade level at this point, right? Is that right? 5th or 6th grade level, Jackie?
Yeah.
So he's in 9th grade. He needs more practice than typical peers to learn new information and vocabulary. And this is something we find with students. There are a good number of our students, and I would dare to say a lot of our mixed type struggling readers may just need more practice than we typically give them in our core instruction to learn new things. And so when we're addressing these issues, we want to be careful that we're providing a sufficient amount of practice for the student to master skills. Because we see this with older students where they've partially mastered skills and everything's moved on away from that. And then they get confused in their skill development. His reading, handwriting, and spelling are all below grade level in accuracy and fluency. A lot of these students' handwriting is very slow, and the research shows that handwriting supports learning beginning reading. And even though the student may have keyboarding skills, we're going to be wanting to use handwriting in a remedial an intervention where we're addressing earlier skill deficits in reading. He has had reading difficulty throughout school, and even though he's gotten intervention, we've seen this in students who are older. They are either getting corrective reading or some kind of guided reading or balanced literacy intervention, or else they're getting something like half of Wilson one year, the next year they get a different one, the next year they get a different intervention. So there's no consistency across grades, and sometimes the inconsistency between the intervention that they got and the classroom instruction doesn't allow them to transfer the skills over to learning the content in class. So this is a student who's been struggling all the way through school, but they haven't necessarily been identified with a disability. And schools are very reluctant to identify kids with an SLD later in schooling. That's what I found. In middle and high school, you don't get a lot of kids who are identified with like a specific learning disability that late in schooling. This is a student, and we see this happen, who has maintained passing grades through middle school. And the way that he did this was by working 3 and 4 times harder than every other kid needs to do in order to get there. And so the student, his family may say, you know what, he works so hard, he works till 11 o'clock every night, he's listening to everything on tape, and he gets to 9th grade and hits the wall because the demands are so much higher in high school than they are in elementary, even intermediate and middle school. And so even though he has highly motivated kid, he's not feeling great about himself. He doesn't have a sense of efficacy that he can do it on his own necessarily, and he uses a lot of compensatory strategies. If the student's working, for example, you'll see this kind of student if they're working with someone who's supporting their learning, an instructional assistant or like a paraprofessional, they can easily become dependent upon the paraprofessional's supports or other accommodations and supports that they've been given to help scaffold them through the content. Makes sense, Jackie?
Yeah, it absolutely does, right? And that it is important to scaffold them through the content, but that's not enough, right? We can allow them to record our lectures. We can give them, there's a super cool device, it's a pen, and then the student writes with the pen while they're taking notes, but it's also a recorder. And then they can go home and they can fill in the notes that they weren't able to take during class, right? There's lots of assistive technology. That's all terrific for content area learning, but it's not enough to keep them up with the content. We also have to address their reading skills because they have to be able to read adequately. There comes a point, particularly when the student transitions from middle to high school, where those accommodations aren't enough to keep them making progress through the content areas, even with those supports.
There's no way you can possibly listen to the text that you need to learn in content area. There's just no other more efficient way to get information until they have that thing from the Matrix where they plug it in the back of your head and all the knowledge goes in. Like there's no better way than reading to get the information that you need to learn.
And
And
they're
so,
not going to, they're going to need this in life, right? They're going to be in job situations, in hopefully post-secondary education or other sorts of post-secondary employment and training opportunities where they're going to need to have these reading skills. So it's not enough to just accommodate so that they can learn the content. That's important, but they also need that reading intervention.
yeah, that's a great point. And these are not kids who don't want to read. These are kids who may believe that they can't be taught, or may have learned that it's their fault they can't learn to read, or they'll never learn to read, or they're dumb, but in fact they may be highly motivated and very capable of learning, and they just need to have the appropriate instruction focused on the appropriate skills. So this student's word recognition is below the ninth grade level in all of these assessments we might get in a CBM like a Dibbles or an Acadience or an AIMSweb. The Acadience mentor training, they told us the nonsense word fluency is the one that separates the compensators from the dyslexics. But at this point, with this type of Jamie's type of student, you're going to see low scores on all of these because, like we said, they're not only do they have things they've memorized and they can read well, but then there'll be a raft of things that they have trouble decoding, and also things that they are confused about because they partially learned a pattern or they partially learned a syllable finding strategy or something, and they're not able to apply it consistently. Comprehension will be poor, and language comprehension may be affected by the lack of practice through wide reading. And so, when I taught ninth grade, we had students who were getting assessed every 3 years because they were doing it at the beginning in special ed, and their IQs would be dropping over time. And it was like, that's not supposed to happen. It's just that their knowledge base has not kept up with the knowledge base of the people they're being normed against. And that's just a result of not being able to get that good information in that efficient way through reading, informational text and, instructional text. Their phonemic awareness may show deficits in phoneme identification, segmentation, and blending, which are all essential for developing orthographic mapping. And their spelling errors may even be phonologically consistent, so that it can give you a sense of where the student is. They just need this knowledge that they have to cohere with the knowledge that they need to know. So it may be that they have pieces of this, but you want to make sure that they're using it both for reading and for spelling, and you want to look at their spelling errors to see, is what they're hearing consistent. So they may spell a word like white, W-I-G-H-T, which is phonologically consistent. They just don't know the patterns. So is the phonology of it the difficulty, or is the difficulty the sound symbol association? And this may be something you need to tease out with a student like Jamie. Sometimes they don't know the phonological tasks. So you have to be careful when you're assessing that you're teaching the task at the same time to be sure that that's not the reason the student's giving you incorrect answers. You might find that the orthographic knowledge is inconsistent. So there are patterns they know for reading, but not for spelling, etc. And these are the students who overgeneralize list common spellings for vowel sounds, like the IGH and the EIGH, and does not have strategies. They'll look at the word, they'll be able to read the word form, but if you put re in front of it, it looks like an entirely different word, and they can't see the form inside of reform. Okay, and that's where we want to, make that direct their attention to the fact there's a base word and a prefix there, and what are they and how do they go together, and that helps them with their multisyllable decoding. And then for intervention, what we want to do is practice these phonemic awareness skills similarly to the way that we are going to work with them with Althea. We're going to work with Jamie in a similar way. It doesn't take a lot of time and practice, but you have to give them the amount of practice that they need. for all of these skills that we're going to be teaching. And that may be the challenge with an older student. They may need more repetitions of these and practice. And so when you're moving the sequence, scope, and sequence along a little more to more challenging multi-syllable words, you may be able to build in more practice for that student who needs the additional practice opportunities to really nail it down and master this. To build his confidence, we want to control the instructional materials and select words for spelling and reading that students are unlikely to have memorized. So you want to find out what are the things he already knows and have memorized, because if we ask him to spell something he already knows, he's not practicing anything. It's just something that he already knows. He's not necessarily learning something, although that can be incorporated in like sentence dictation and that kind of thing. And then we're following the structured literacy routines for review, just similarly to what we'd use a very similar lesson plan to the one we used for Althea for Jamie. And we're going to be practicing things in one syllable words up until the point where we've taught the closed syllable pattern, okay? If he doesn't know any short vowels, we're going to teach short A first, but if he has some short vowels, we can move right to teaching the closed syllable pattern so that we can get into the multi-syllable words, okay? And once the closed syllable is mastered, we do the VCCV, and then we're able to add the vowel and consonant spellings and practice in the context of the multi-syllable words. And so that's how we're changing this instructional sequence. There are the things that are similar to what we did with Althea, and then there are these things we're doing to move him into upper level language, more of the academic multisyllabic word reading. Anything we need to add to that? That makes sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I just think maybe talking a little bit about like recursive practice. And so like just because that student masters this thing with a certain amount of practice in one or two lessons, we have to continually be providing more opportunities to practice those known skills, right? We're kind of moving this student at a little more complex of a level than Althea. And so we can't just do like a couple lessons and then done, or the student is likely to forget that pattern, right? So we just have to continually keep providing that recursive practice of these known patterns and skills.
Yeah, and we're intentionally building in the previously learned skills
Hmm.
in the word lists, in the
Hmm.
sentence dictation, in the reading. That's
Right,
never going away. We're never
right.
moving on from something and it's not included in the lesson. That's an excellent point. So additional considerations, though the focus of this intervention is Jamie's decoding, which is critical to future employment and education, we want to make sure we're using additional scaffolding to develop his knowledge base, his background knowledge, his vocabulary, and we want to be working on his oral language skills at the same time to compensate for the time that he has not been able to build on these things through wide reading. And it's never too late for this student to catch up in these areas. Life is long. There's a long time, there's no law that you have to go to college and take a full college schedule. You could take one. I have a student right now who's taking one college course at a time to become a paraprofessional in education, and and doing well at that pace. So we want to give them everything that we possibly can to allow them to develop their skills. Did you want to add to that, Jackie?
Um, No, I don't think so. I do, it's kind of such a cliche about, oh, we have to have high expectations for all of our students, but it's true, right? So Jamie's in ninth grade. He's reading at a third grade level or fourth grade level. That doesn't mean I'm not suggesting that it's going to be super easy to catch him up to 12th grade by the time he graduates, but that should be our goal, right? That is our goal, is to get him reading successfully and competently in his content areas as well as in his reading for pleasure, for outside reading, so that he leaves high school with the competencies that he needs to be successful in post whatever he chooses to do post-secondary.
That's right. And it's all about preparing every person for that transition to education and careers, further education and careers, and moving ahead in whatever career that you're in.